Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by Professor of Political Science at Singapore Management University, Chandran Kukathas, and we are discussing his book, Immigration and Freedom. Chandran, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So this book offers a critique of immigration controls, but has maybe a unique emphasis compared to maybe similar books. Can you say a bit about your general thesis and what makes this book different from other defenses of freer migration?
Well, most books defending immigration tend to look at it from the perspective of the immigrant. The arguments usually are that people have the right to move, or that people's conditions would be improved if they were free to move. So you could have either rights arguments or utilitarian arguments. What's relatively rarely addressed by defenders of immigration, not so much critics, is the impact of immigration controls on the host society. People don't really think too much about this. And what I try to argue in my book is that one of the things we need to be concerned about with respect to immigration controls is the impact on citizens and residents of the potential host society, because attempts to control immigration really mean imposing restrictions or limitations, not only on immigrants or would-be immigrants, but also on citizens. If you want to control outsiders, you have to control insiders. And this is largely because immigration controls aren't primarily about controlling borders or controlling border crossings. What most immigration controls are about is controlling what people can do once they've crossed the border. That is to say, regulators want to control the extent to which people are free to move around within the country, the extent to which they're free to do things like take jobs, enroll in college, open bank accounts, rent, and so on. And once you try to control these things, what this means is that you really have to control your own citizens, because they are all too ready to engage with outsiders. They're happy to employ them. They're happy to do business with them, to trade, to enroll them in college, to rent to them, and so on. So the more seriously you try to control outsiders, the more significantly you're going to have to control insiders. And let me just give you one dramatic statistic to illustrate this. Between, say, 1930 and 2000 in the United States, about 1 million American citizens were wrongfully deported. That is to say, they were in an attempt to control immigration, mostly immigration from Mexico. The US governments and states decided to deport those who were illegal aliens within the country. And of course, they made a mistake. They deported about 2 million people, but 1 million of those were American citizens. So this gives you just one illustration of the way in which immigration controls can seriously affect citizens and residents of a country as much as they affect outsiders.
You just gave that example of citizens being deported by mistake, and the time frame you gave was from roughly 1930 until now, correct?
Yes.
Is it become more or less common over time? And is this something that is pretty common to immigration controls around the world, or is that at all unique to the United States?
It's still pretty common, not only in the United States, but also in Australia, in the EU, in Canada. In part, it's because obviously mistakes are made, but in fact, the number of mistakes is quite significant. And the numbers are even greater once you take into account the number of people in the EU or in the United States who are in detention because they are suspected of having violated immigration laws. And again, this is certain large numbers of citizens who have absolute rights to be in the countries in question.
And so just to reiterate, I think your point is that obviously immigration restrictions restrict the freedom of potential migrants from moving to a host country, but they do much more than that. They necessarily have to restrict the freedom of insiders and citizens as well, because there would be no point in having immigration controls otherwise, because clearly those rules are there because natives do want to interact with immigrants. You just mentioned we're talking about, deporting citizens by mistake, and this is an obvious way where you're restricting the freedom of citizens as well, because citizens are having this fairly dramatic thing happen to them, being deported by mistake in the process of trying to restrict migration. But is that something that is unique to immigration law, or is that more common than, say, other types of law where people are wrongfully arrested, wrongfully convicted or something? Is this just always the cost of doing business with having a legal system, or do you think this is more common in this particular domain?
I'm not sure whether it's more common in this domain. I guess my main point is not so much that this means that we should abandon all attempts at control. Really, the point I want to make is that we have to recognize this particular trade-off. So the question is, how important is it to control immigration, and is it worth this particular cost? So one of these costs is obviously deportation, but there are quite a lot of other costs as well that fall on citizens. For example, immigration controls, again, because they are directed at people who've already arrived in the country primarily to stop them from working or enrolling in universities or renting and so on. What this means that you're also controlling your citizens who might trade with them. So you're going to be restricting employers, which means you're going to have to monitor and regulate them. Of course, employers are in fact subject to regulations in all kinds of ways anyway. So I don't want to say that, get rid of all regulations, because any regulations can be removed. But the question really is, well, how much are you gaining from these regulations? And are you aware of how much you're losing? And I think you could say this really about all forms of regulations. You should probably do a serious cost-benefit analysis. And that cost in the analysis should include the cost of freedom.
Yeah, I think that's part of what I was driving at is you're a classical liberal, and as am I, and I think people who share that worldview are going to be very sympathetic to these costs. But if they're not, are you offering arguments that are going to be also persuasive to someone who is coming from, a more traditionalist, like conservative perspective or a left progressive perspective or something? Or are these arguments mainly going to appeal to classical liberals?
My aim really was to appeal least of all to classical liberals, because in a sense, I think they're already on board for a variety of reasons, from they're thinking about human rights or because of their thinking about the ills of government and control and so on. So the book is really addressed to those who are more in favor of immigration controls. So there, the argument is basically, look, if you want to control immigration, are you aware of the impact this has on citizens of your country? And secondly, if you think that these controls are worth it, even though they do impose heavy burdens on your citizens, why do you think that this is worth it? And I think there are really three kinds of arguments that defenders of immigration control can offer. One is economic arguments, to say that it's economically beneficial. The other is cultural arguments, to say that we're protecting our identity in some way. And the third is a kind of self-determination argument. So half of my book is really directed at answering those challenges from the economic perspective, that say immigration control is necessary for our economic well-being. Then arguments that say immigration controls are necessary for cultural protection. And then thirdly, arguments that say that immigration controls are necessary because we are a self-determining country. So I do try to address primarily those people who are unsympathetic to immigration.
If you're turning on like right-wing talk radio or something, you might get the impression that the economic arguments against immigration are much stronger than they really are. It seems like in your book, you engage more with the more economically literate critics of immigration. George Borjas, am I getting the name right? Is one of the more prominent ones. And So isn't it the case that of the more sophisticated critics, even those critical of the economic effects of immigration are not claiming that these are like gigantic and catastrophic effects?
Yes, I mean, even Borjas, who's quite critical of immigration, and certainly he's not in favor of dramatic reductions in immigration, but he's on the whole in favor of a greater degree of immigration control than I am. But even he does not suggest that there are any enormous gains to be made by controlling immigration. In citing the then most recent comprehensive study of immigration conducted, he says, on the whole, if you're trying to make an economic argument for either for immigration control or against immigration control, the differences, depending on the methodologies you use, are so small that we would generally have to say that the impact of immigration is on the economy is negligible. I'm more inclined to agree with someone like Michael Clemens, who thinks that the gains from immigration are much greater than the critics of immigration control, or rather the critics of immigration suggest. And I think this is largely because most studies don't really look very far into the future, and they don't take into account many of the side effects of immigration control, the positive side effects of immigration control, economically speaking. I mean, your podcast is called Ideas Have Sex. Well, if you have more immigration, you actually have a lot more ideas having a lot more sex, and this has extraordinary positive benefits. But they're difficult to quantify. So I wouldn't try to say, here are the things that we can definitely say will come out of immigration. But, we've got some proxies for this. For example, if you look at the number of entrepreneurs, the number of enterprises that are created, the number of multimillionaires or billionaires who emerged, were self-made, they are disproportionately immigrants of one sort or another. And among immigrants, they're disproportionately poorer immigrants and disproportionately refugees. So if you took the poorest people coming to the country, chances are there's a good number of those who are actually going to turn out to be people who will bring enormous economic benefits. But you can't ever quantify this. Who's to say what would have been the impact of someone like Sergey Brin coming to the United States, 30 or 40 years ago? And there are numerous cases like this. So I think the critics of immigration control underestimate this, but it's difficult to make a case with facts and figures.
But I mean, to disagree with what you just said, I think you'd have to entertain this really unlikely, implausible scenario where large numbers of people living in very poor countries with dysfunctional legal systems, that in their current situation, they're somehow optimized for what they can offer the world. That just seems insane. Like, obviously, many, if not all of them, are going to be better able to be functional, contributing members of society in a better functioning society.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. In fact, what you're doing really in imposing these restrictions, you're disrupting the functioning of the market. And that's in several ways. One is, of course, you're putting in place obstacles to trade. And trade, by its nature, is always a positive sum game. So you're reducing that. But also, you're distorting the labor market in another way. A lot of people who move would simply move for opportunities and then move back. There's a lot of circular migration. But a lot of this is disrupted by the fact that obstacles to migration incentivize people, once they've crossed a border, to simply stay put, rather than go back and forth as opportunity dictates. So what they end up doing is, firstly, underutilizing their actual skills, staying in place, having to conceal their identities and so on, all of which is a great economic negative. It's striking that, for example, once Brexit happened, immigration to the United Kingdom actually increased, despite all of the measures that were then taken in order to reduce immigration. It's simply increased enormously. And what studies show is that a large part of the reason for this is, people move and stay. They don't move back to their home countries because it's too risky.
Oh, I see.
Once
So
this
people, migrants who otherwise would have come and gone back were now more keen to get there and stay because
yeah,
the
yeah.
chances of coming back are lower.
Exactly, exactly. And the perverse outcome of this is actually more immigration, but less efficient immigration. That is to say, when one thinks of immigration, of course, one usually thinks about people who are moving to settle. But in fact, human movement is very various. People move for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of lengths of time. I mean, if you look at the UN definition of an immigrant, it says it's someone who is outside his or her country of nationality for more than a year. Well, why a year? Why not 6 months? Why not 2 years? Why not five? It's an arbitrary number. And scholars who study immigration basically make much the same assumption because you've got to make some definitional decisions if you're going to measure migration. But in reality, you can look at migration in the way accountants do, both as a stock and as a flow. Well, a lot of migration is a flow rather than a stock. People don't just move and stay, they move and move back. So, in trying to assess how much migration there is, you've both got to make an estimate of how much your stock is increasing, but also how much flow there is. Well, immigration controls really disrupt the flow, the in and out of this. And of course, people move in and out because it suits them and it suits the people they're trading with, employers, other residents, schools, and so on. And they work this out in ways that would be most efficient for all the parties concerned. If you put an artificial obstruction there, you're disrupting that trade. And so all the trades become suboptimal.
Something else that gets disrupted is remittances. Do we have good numbers on the amount of money that migrants tend to send back home and how that compares to other kinds of foreign aid?
I don't have up-to-date numbers, but I can tell you that remittances simply dwarf foreign aid. Immigrants send back to their home countries remittances that are far in excess of the amount of money that, say, the United States or the UK contribute in foreign aid. So for sending countries, the income from remittances can be a very significant part of this. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages for the host countries of having money come in this way. In some ways, it's an advantage because the money is not just going to a bureaucracy or an aid agency that distributes that money politically rather than economically. But there are also imbalances because it's an advantage to those who've been able to send their family members abroad to work and send money home, but doesn't do so well for those who aren't able to do so. So it could exacerbate certain sorts of inequalities. But on the whole, I think, it's a very positive thing. And maybe one thing that's not discussed very much in the literature, and I actually don't discuss it in my book, which I wish I had. We think about immigration control as something that's exercised by the receiving country. That's what immigration control is about. And we think of it as a measure of our self-determination, that we control the borders, we control the flow. But in fact, in the world generally, immigration control is a government-to-government matter. It's not as if countries unilaterally decide on immigration. These things are negotiated. There are international regimes, there is international law, and governments negotiate with one another what kinds of controls they will have. The EU is an obvious example because they have a shared external border, even though they've got free internal movement. So France or Germany or Italy don't have unilateral abilities or rights to control immigration. The other thing that's worth noting is that countries also control emigration to a significant degree. And let me give you two examples. One is the Philippines and the other is Indonesia. Both of these countries send out a lot of workers, nurses, domestic help, and so on. All of this is very closely controlled. Those Filipinos who want to go abroad to work have to actually get special permission in order to do so. They have to apply for an exit permit. And they also need, if they want to get jobs in, say, domestic service or nursing or in shipping, which is a lot of the world's shipping is run, especially cruise ships, run by Filipinos. They need to get permission from the government and they need to get government authorized or accredited training. So here what we have is the government actually, in effect, having an immigration, or rather a migrant export industry. Same is true in Indonesia with domestic workers. They are trained before they can go abroad. So the idea that, a country like the United States or the UK simply, you know, opens or closes the borders to Filipino nurses is not quite right. All of these things are negotiated between governments, between cities, between states. Immigration control is a two-way thing. It's a multi-party exchange in which the workers themselves are often not directly involved.
The examples you just gave, I didn't know that. I'm mostly familiar with emigration restrictions in the context of communist countries.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that there are, smaller forms of that outside of the communist world. You gave two examples, but is that fairly common? And if so, for those examples, do the governments restrict emigration for people who otherwise would want to come back, or is it just period, anyone who wants to leave?
So if you take the Philippines case, curiously, it's only an emigration restriction if you want to work. I mean, Filipinos are perfectly at liberty to go abroad on holidays, to move countries. It's not prohibited or forbidden. But if you want to go abroad to work, you do have to fill in the paperwork and get permission and so on, which is not to say that it's difficult, although it is time-consuming and costly because the Filipino bureaucracy is still a bureaucracy. It's not like the situation in former communist countries where leaving the country is prohibited. It's more that it's controlled in a certain sort of way. I don't know enough about other countries that manage migration or manage emigration, but there are quite a few of them that have emigration programs for workers that are being sent abroad. So a number of countries in North Africa, countries like Bangladesh, these are all well recognized as essentially migration export countries.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a break to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for listening to these episodes and giving me the opportunity to speak with people I admire and read amazing books every week, every other week, whatever. If you are interested in helping this little engine that could of a show grow, please just recommend it to a friend. Recommend it to a friend. Maybe give it a 5-star rating on one of those places you listen to it at. But really, if you just recommend it to someone, that goes a long way for a small show like this. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. Keep listening. And back to the show. I had a question about your book that I thought of hearing a critique of Brian Kaplan's book, Open Borders. One critique was that, his book was maybe too U.S. focused. I don't think your book suffers from that issue. It's very international in scope, but there's probably more data on some countries than others. But when you're addressing the arguments for immigration restriction, two common ones are like fiscal drain. How much are immigrants a fiscal drain on government services? Do they receive more in services than they pay in taxes? And another one is, are they a good cultural fit? Are they going to come and be a cultural drag on the host country? Are they going to not fit in with the norms or bring toxic norms from their host country, et cetera? And something I'm always wondering is that sensitive at all to what host country you're talking about? Like, that may not be the case in the United States, but maybe is it the case in France? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm thinking of some European countries, for instance, because my guess is that a country like France has, say, much stricter labor market regulations than the US. So that's one reason to think migrants are going to move to France and not have the opportunity to work, and so not integrate as well culturally, economically, etc. Are there big differences country to country in how these arguments play out for or against immigration controls?
Yeah, I think it does vary from country to country. Some things that might affect this are things like the size of the country, the extent to which people are free to move to the country they want to can make a difference. For example, culturally. Let me try to give you a kind of instance. Most immigrants moving to Europe non-legally, whether they're coming through boats or secretly in overland and so on, generally want to get to the UK or to France or to Germany as their preferred destinations. Now, this is especially the case if they are coming in to seek refuge under the Refugee Convention. The first country that they arrive in and claim asylum, they have to claim asylum in that country. Now, if someone actually wants to get to France or to Germany, but they have to come through Italy, well, they're going to be stuck if they're caught. So if they end up in a place that they really don't want to be, I think that could be a challenge. That could be disruptive. Curiously, there are countries like the Czech Republic or Hungary that are very hostile to immigration, but most people coming through Hungary and the Czech Republic don't want to go there. These are not places where they think they're going to prosper. They want to get to France, they want to get to Germany, and so on. So if you're in the Czech Republic and you're saying we really want to close those borders because these people are not going to integrate, well, firstly, you're kind of right because they don't want to stop there. But on the other hand, it's not really a problem for you because they don't want to make that their destination. About 10 years ago, I debated a member of the European Parliament in the Czech Republic in Prague at a town hall. And everyone in the town hall, perhaps except for me, was worried about immigration. But everyone agreed that none of the immigrants really wanted to come to the Czech Republic. So that's one thing. It can make a difference if you force people to be in a place they don't want to be. That, I think, is not a recipe for good community relations. But then the other kind of argument you might consider is one that says, well, okay, if these people are coming in, what if they're culturally different? Let's say they're coming to France or they're coming to the UK. Let's say that they are Muslim, which is usually something that people are concerned about. Is the size of the Muslim majority rising? Are they bringing those sorts of customs and so on? Is that going to be a worry? I think on the whole, there's very little evidence that this is a worry, but a lot's going to turn on the kind of policies that you have. If you have policies that increasingly demonize such people and isolate them and make it more difficult for them to live freely, you will make that identity much more significant than it needs to be. I mean, most people who move from, let's say, from Afghanistan or from Pakistan or from Iraq, their aim is actually not to go and propagate their particular religious convictions. They're moving because they want safety or they want economic improvement. If you had a policy that said, okay, well, let's figure out how we can make it easier for such people to prosper here, I think you would have a very different outcome than you would if you had one that demonizes such people. The problem in any democracy, of course, is that there will always be some portion of the population that's worried about these things. And it's almost impossible to expect that no politician will try to take advantage of fears in the community to say, I'm the one who's going to protect you from this particular problem or this particular ill. And so, I think this is a genuine challenge. I don't think the problem is the people themselves. I think the problem is, what's going to happen whenever you get foreign people moving into a new country or a new part of the world. In some ways, it doesn't matter even if you're just moving from, one part of the country to another, depending on the region. Some cities aren't all that welcoming of outsiders from different parts of the UK, for example, because it changes the composition. When the medical school at Durham University consolidated and a lot of people were going to move in from a nearby area with its own medical school, there were a lot of locals who were quite upset about this because, again, a small place, big influx of new people changes things. You can also recognize that, again, using the UK as an example, there are lots of communities that resent people from London coming in and buying holiday homes and, becoming occasional tourists and, changing property values, changing the density of the towns and so on. It doesn't take a lot to make people upset in some ways. To some extent, I think we simply have to accept that this is always going to be the case and we'll have to manage and negotiate it. I don't think there's a silver bullet that's going to solve this.
Yeah, especially in the modern world. I mean, at one point in time, change probably almost always happens slowly enough that you didn't see it over the course of a decade or so, but now you do. And yeah, I understand. I guess that's going to make some people upset. Wanted to read a quote from the book. Really interesting to me. It's a part of the book where you're talking about, the historical recency of a lot of immigration control and how we think about immigration, and that, it's easy to maybe think that things have always been this way. But I want to read this quote and have you comment on it. You say, "Yet it was not until the rise of Napoleon that any ruler took the trouble to locate a country's borders with precision, not until the First World War that serious efforts were made to control the movement of people between countries, and not until the 1960s that the most prosperous countries in the world thought it necessary to distinguish legal from illegal migration." That kind of blew me away. Can you comment on that?
On the first part of that passage, it's simply a technical reality that, until relatively recently, countries simply did not have the technology or the financial resources to manage and control their borders, because, you need to have, very precise instruments to actually draw the boundaries to establish what they are. I mean, I think it was Louis XIV who once said that when the map of France was redrawn more accurately, he lost more territory then than he did in all the wars he'd ever fought. Where do the boundaries lie? Nowadays, we take it for granted that we can click on Google Maps and we know where the boundaries are. Some boundaries are actually a bit obscure because some things are classified by government, so we don't actually know where the exact border is between India and Pakistan, let's say, but leave that aside. It's relatively recently that we really had that capacity. And if you think about it, in the 19th century, it would have cost a lot of money. You wouldn't have had satellite imaging. You wouldn't have had, all the sorts of things we have available to us today. So you would have had to send in an army of surveyors to establish the boundaries. And so it wasn't until Napoleon that any of the European states really did this systematically.
And this is, I imagine, outside of very obvious geographical boundaries like a coastline or something.
Exactly, yeah. Some boundaries are relatively easy. And in fact, most boundaries do track natural phenomena, whether they're mountain ranges or rivers or oceans and so on. But of course, boundaries also change because of conquests and, agreements of various kinds. So, the boundaries are not necessarily things that are terribly stable. And of course, for a long time, there were simply no actual boundaries because the borders between, let's say, France and Germany were simply fuzzy. And to a significant extent, unless you've got a state that's actually capable of exercising control of the hinterland or the peripheries are going to be relatively self-governing. But as the modern state has emerged and its capacity to control has increased, so has its capacity to demarcate, the boundaries of the state. So on that first part, I think it's fairly, plain that the technical challenges have meant that it's only relatively recently that borders have been clear. Even then, it's also interesting to ask exactly what we mean by a border anyway. I mean, I used to be an advocate of open borders until I decided that actually I'm not really sure what exactly it means for a border to be open, because for most people in the world, it's actually relatively easy to actually cross a border. I mean, in the EU, you can cross the border very easily. If you want to move to the United States, it's generally pretty easy to actually, get on a plane and arrive in the US, unless you're from, let's say, China or an African country. But that's not what we mean when we want to open the borders. What we mean when we want to open the borders is actually give people more rights once they've crossed the border. So I'm an advocate of more free immigration, but not so much an advocate of open borders, because I think that term is under-theorized. And there's a lot more in the book about that. But to go back to your question, what was the second part of the quotation that you read?
Not until the First World War that serious efforts were made to control the movement of people between countries.
Right. So the attempt to control movement has always been there to some degree. I mean, we've had passports until the 19th century, but for people to move from one place to another always has been subject to some sort of control. A lot of it, interestingly, in the past was emigration control, because when labor was an asset, to have workers leave or move was something that you didn't really want. You wanted to keep that asset. So towns and cities were loath to make it easy for people to move, but you could still move. Moving, let's say, within a country was not that difficult. Moving across countries was also much more straightforward. In fact, in the earliest days in Europe, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you may have needed a passport to move, but getting a passport didn't mean getting a passport from your own country. 1900, I could have gone to Belgium and asked for a Belgian passport as an English subject. So it was really after the First World War when European states started to worry about refugee flows that the passports were solidified, made more necessary for movement. Even then, it was not really until the 1960s that border controls were tightened even further in an attempt to control the movement of people. In the United States, in part because they wanted to control movements of people from Mexico. Although even then, the border was relatively open. You didn't need a passport to cross the border as an American. There was a lot of circular migration of Mexicans who worked. The category of illegal immigrant did not exist. You won't find this term used. And even, in the early 2000s, up until recently, most legal scholars were scratching their heads when the term illegal immigrant was used, because there is no such, or was no such category in international law or in domestic law. So one of the reasons that I've written the book in the way that I have is what I want to draw attention to is the trade-off involved in immigration control. And what I want to say is that the more you try to control immigration, the more regulations you put in place, the more you're going to see a loss of freedom. That isn't to say that means simply that, let's get rid of all immigration controls. But I want to say, this is the trade-off you've got to understand. And that trade-off has evolved as a result of, the increasing amount of control that's been developed over the last 60 years or so. And I want to say, well, each time you increase the amount of control, there is a greater loss of freedom. Are you prepared for this trade-off?
Can you elaborate on how immigration controls conflict with the rule of law? You have a section on that, and you reference several legal scholars and traditional aspects of the rule of law, promulgation and openness and all this. And you argue that immigration restrictions are in a good deal of tension with that. So one, I'd like to ask, how is that? And do you think, again, is that more so or differently than other types of law?
So here's a relatively straightforward way of thinking about this. Okay, it's said that in the United States, there are about 12 million illegal immigrants. Candidate Trump has said that if he becomes president, he will basically deport all of them. Now, the thing is, if you're going to deport a lot of people, 12 million people, let's say, you've got to go through a legal process, because firstly, you've got to establish who they are. You've got to establish that they don't have the right of residency, and that even if they don't have the right of residency, they could be in a complicated situation. I mean, for example, let's say, I've moved to the United States. I fall in love. I decide I want to get married. Maybe I do get married to an American. My visa expires. So I go to the US government and say, hey, look, my visa expired, but I'm now married to an American citizen. I want to stay. Can I? They say, yes, you can stay while we process your application. So now at this point, I'm both legal because I've been told I can stay, but I'm illegal because my visa has expired, right? So there are lots of cases like this in the United States. If you want to deport 12 million people, it's going to cost you a lot of time, a lot of money. You're going to need courts, you're going to need processing centers, you're going to need police, and so on. So the question is, how much money and time and institutional resources are you going to be willing to put into this process? Now, At the moment, the US, with its current institutions, has the capacity to deport about 400,000 people a year going through due process. This means it's going to take you 25 years to deport 12 million people, okay, assuming no one else comes in. How are you going to deport, 12 million in a year without actually abandoning a lot of these processes and procedures? If you want to do this quickly, as, say, candidate Trump wants to do, you're going to have to go outside the law. Now, again, the question is, are you prepared to do this? This is a trade-off you'd have to make. And I think it's a fairly substantial trade-off. I mentioned at the start that 1 million Americans were wrongly deported, over the course of the 20th century. Well, I think you're going to see a lot of wrongful deportations because, the more you try to go outside the law in order to meet targets, the more you're going to make these sorts of mistakes. Most of the Americans who were wrongly deported as Mexicans were deported because they were misidentified. And they were misidentified because, states and agencies had targets to meet. Got to deport so many people by this time. Well, if you set people those sorts of targets, they will end up making a lot of mistakes. The other side of it is that when you give people these sorts of powers, you increase the likelihood of the abuse of power. The less oversight you have of agencies such as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, the greater the chances of their misusing their powers. And there's plenty of evidence of this already, the mistreatment of both immigrants and non-immigrants who come under the watchful gaze of migration authorities.
Yeah, my guess also is that if you're dealing with immigration restriction, you're dealing with people who presumably don't have the same procedural legal rights as American citizens, and as a result might be more subject to abuse, especially if they're being misidentified or when they're actually citizens. But even if they're not, just because there's maybe a technical legal right to deport someone doesn't mean there is a technical legal right to mistreat them in numerous other ways. But if they don't have, the same kind of standing in courts or whatever, or sympathy with public opinion or something, then they may be more likely to be mistreated.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. But it's interesting the extent to which this will rebound on citizens themselves. So, for example, whether you're talking about the EU or you're talking about the United States, immigration authorities have been given increased powers of stop and search within a certain number of miles of the boundary. I think in the US, it's now within 100 miles of the boundary. Well, American citizens in principle have strong rights against, being stopped and searched. The Bill of Rights certainly guarantees that they can't be unless there is some sort of probable cause. But this doesn't apply to immigration. Now, that means that, in effect, for a lot of Americans, they've lost that right if they're within a certain number of miles of the border, because immigration officials are entitled to stop and search even without probable cause because they're immigration officials. Well, is this a violation of the rule of law or a weakening of the rule of law? You can argue about this. I would say it's got some bearing on the rule of law because American citizens will have lost a certain very important right.
What countries do you think now or in the past, but especially now, have had the best or maybe the least bad immigration policies?
That's an interesting question because, in some ways, a country like the United States has been enormously welcoming of immigrants. So for most of its history, it's been very easy for people to move to America. Not that there's been no restrictions. I mean, for example, in the United States, there were for a long time restrictions on the basis of race. But on the whole, I think the United States stacks up pretty well, even though both the Mexican border and the Canadian border have at various times been very thoroughly policed. In fact, 100 years ago, you were more likely to have people trying to come in to the United States without authorization through Canada. So the Canadian border was much more carefully monitored than the Mexican one. But the United States, I think, has a pretty good record overall, but one that's diminishing. The curious thing is that for a lot of people, it's actually quite easy to move to the United States, but for some people, it's not. Okay, so, and the same is true of the European Union or the UK. If you're from Africa or from Afghanistan, it's very difficult to move authorized to the UK. I would say, it would be easier for an Afghan to pass through the eye of a needle than to get legal authority to move to the United Kingdom. That's just the way it is. But on the other hand, it's very easy for a lot of other people. It was easy for me to move there. It was easy for my sisters in Malaysia to travel across. So it's not easy to actually say who has the best. Australia has, always had very tight immigration controls, but also has a very strong pro-immigration population. And they continue to bring in a lot of immigrants. But at the same time, they also control immigration in ways that have all these side effects, which is really what I'm worried about.
You live in Singapore. Does Singaporean immigration policy differ in any interesting ways from other rich countries?
Yes, it does. Now, Singapore, in many ways, has a very open economy, and that includes the labor market. So it's relatively easy for people to come here if they're working professionals. Also, very possible for people to come here and work if they want to be, say, in construction, in low wage industries and so on. What's much more difficult for people to do is to get permanent residence and then ultimately to get citizenship. That is much more tightly controlled. Also, Singapore is not a signatory to the International Refugee Convention, so they don't recognize refugee claims at all. You cannot come and make a claim for residence or settlement in Singapore on the basis of your being a refugee in the way that you can in Indonesia or in Malaysia. Singapore just does not recognize this. So Singapore has a very open economy, but it's very carefully controlled. And when you're done, you're done. You may have been in the country for a dozen years, but length of residence does not give you an automatic entitlement to apply for permanent residence in the way that, say, it does in the United States or in the UK. If you've been in the UK for 10 years, you're almost guaranteed the right to apply for, and you probably will receive permanent residence. It's simply not the case in a place like Singapore.
You had an interesting bit on the history of immigration policy within the British Empire that I didn't know. Can you say something about the openness within the British Empire?
Yes, this is an interesting thing, really, and it goes to an issue that's also at the heart of the book, which is not only the definition of immigrant, but the definition of a national, if you think of these two being the opposite sides of the same coin. By about the middle of the 20th century, or by the time of the Second World War, the British Empire, depending on how you count the people, had something between 4 and 800 million people in it. All of these people, whether you're talking about Ghana or Malaya or Australia or Canada, all of these people were ruled by Britain, and everyone in these societies was a subject of the crown. The UK didn't actually have the category of citizen until 1948, so they weren't necessarily citizens of the UK, but after 1948, they did become citizens of the United Kingdom. They were British nationals and recognized as such in British law. Now, over the next 40 years or so following the Citizenship Act, various people around the world simply lost their British nationality. The British Parliament declared that they were no longer nationals. This was hotly debated in the UK Parliament because many people said, well, you can't do this because these people are in fact British. They're not, foreign. But the law did indeed change. I think some of the last people to lose their British nationality were Australians at, I think, around 1981. But it made a big difference for people, in Malaysia and Singapore and in parts of Africa, in India, because they simply ceased to have British nationality. Now, the interesting question is, how could you just deprive someone of a nationality, particularly since these nationalities were held from birth? I mean, my father was born in Malaya in 1929. He was a British subject, when he worked, he paid taxes that went to the British Crown. Britain could take people to serve in the armed services and so on. So what this illustrates to me is that not only is the definition of immigrant a political matter, so is the definition of a national. You can actually make half your population no longer hold that nationality. And incidentally, the United States is also a country that has done this. I mean, in the early part of the 20th century, if an American woman married a foreigner, she lost her American nationality. This was later amended, so only if you married a foreigner of the wrong race, that is to say, of a race that was not eligible for American citizenship, you lost your nationality as a woman. Didn't apply to men, incidentally. In fact, as late as around the 1980s, a British woman who married a foreigner could not pass on her nationality to her children. But a man could if he married a foreign wife. So, how nationality is settled is not straightforward. It's a highly politicized matter.
In terms of the rights of abode or travel that British subjects had when they were all members of the British Empire or the Commonwealth, they were legally allowed to reside in Britain. Is that right? Were they also legally allowed to travel to anywhere within the empire?
It's a very good question. Technically, yes. But what Britain did was it allowed countries like Australia, South Africa, and Canada, and New Zealand to determine their own immigration policies. Before, in the Australian case, before 1901, they could and did, to some extent, restrict immigration. But from 1901, when Australia formed the federation that it is now, I wouldn't want to say it's independence because they were already self-governing. The first act of the federal parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act. But technically, it was still a part of the British Empire. And so people had the right of travel across the empire under British law. But Britain allowed other countries to restrict immigration according to their own domestic laws.
What year was it, did you say, that they were stripped of?
In Australia, in 1901.
Okay. Wow, that's crazy. What do you think of some of the contemporary immigration policies in like the Gulf monarchies that are in some ways quite open for labor and in some ways, completely off the table for citizenship? I think that's how it works. I don't know. Do you know something about that? The UAE and such?
So if you think about, say, somewhere like the UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai clearly have predominantly non-native populations. I can call them that, although what exactly is a native is something that's contested. But about 80% of Dubai is, maybe even a little bit more, is made up of foreign workers. Now, in one way, they have very limited rights, though, of course, these are also monarchies, so citizens themselves have relatively few political rights compared to the populations of the residents and citizens of places like the UK. I guess the interesting thing about these countries is that how do they manage culturally and economically having such a significant portion of their countries made up of foreign workers? Now, I've been to these places that they're obviously prosperous, they're relatively peaceful, they are clearly, highly productive, but they're not much in the way of political participation. If you take a case like Singapore, well, it has a population approaching 6 million, but only 3.5 million of those are Singaporean, so about 40% is foreign. Again, they have plenty of civil rights, but really no political ones. But Singapore citizens do have significant political rights to vote, stand for parliament, and so on. So if you wanted to have a society that had, the kind of level of immigrant population as, say, the UAE, the question would be what kinds of political institutions would be compatible with that? Would that be compatible with democratic institutions? I'm not sure. I think it would be a tricky matter. How would a democracy operate in a country in which 80% of the population didn't have any political rights? To what extent would some of the politics then become about the rights of non-citizens and so on? So, yeah, I think, it would be interesting to see what that would be like. But that's probably as much as I can tell you about countries like the UAE.
What do you think is the strongest argument on behalf of immigration controls?
Definitely not the economic arguments. The economic arguments, I think, are by far the weakest arguments. Even if you're simply talking about the economic well-being of citizens and didn't put into the equation the impact on the economic welfare of non-citizens and non-residents, the arguments are really just extraordinarily weak. Immigration is just an economic positive. The cultural arguments, I think, are a little bit stronger depending on the place. I don't think they're very strong if you're looking at somewhere like the United States. With 330 million people, you're going to have something really extraordinary or even weird to happen for an influx of immigration to dramatically change anything. Of course, things will change over the course of decades, but that's going to happen anyway, because, in a free country, you don't know what people are going to do. And I imagine that in a lot of ways, citizens of the United States today have more in common with Singaporeans than they have in common with their ancestors of, 150 years ago,
Oh,
culturally,
absolutely.
intellectually, yeah, in religious terms and so on. So I don't think the cultural arguments are very strong there, but I can understand, let's say, if you were a country like Tibet, that you wanted to maintain a certain kind of cultural integrity and you were worried about, an influx of immigrants, that could really change things. I think that's something I would take very seriously.
Do you give Tibet as an example because it's a small country, or because it's neighboring immigrant populations that might conceivably overrun it in this way?
Well, in one way, it already has been overrun. I mean,
Yeah.
it's been absorbed by China since the 1950s. China's claimed that it is a part of China. But the reason I chose Tibet is its cultural particularity and relative homogeneity. I think that's probably declining, but it's that I had in mind. Maybe the same would be true of somewhere like Nepal, for example. Though even here, I think it's tricky to the extent that, when we look at people wanting to preserve cultural integrity and are willing to sacrifice, let's say, economic advance in order to preserve that, we have to ask, well, what part of the country actually has that preference? Because clearly some people would rather welcome immigrants and would welcome change. So what is it that gives those with the preference for continuity, what gives them the right to impose their preference on those who would prefer to see change, who would rather lose some cultural homogeneity for the benefit of economic prosperity? So it's not clear to me that even in a small country, it's obvious that one part of the population has the right to dictate to the rest, even if that part of the population is a majority. Could be that they're the wealthy majority, whereas the poor would prefer a more open economy that gave them more opportunities, allowed them to rise, and so on. So I think the cultural argument is not a very strong argument.
If the preference is strong enough, I imagine you could have smaller private communities like the Amish or something, more geared towards maintaining a strict cultural homogeneity that's out of step with the modern world. And that's certainly possible. Most people don't actually care enough to do that, but certainly some do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing about people's cultural preferences is that they are ultimately preferences not only about how they live, but how others live. And then you have to, in a free society, you have to ask that question. Well, to what extent can you impose your preferences on me? I mean, those in, let's say, the UK or the US or Australia or France who want to say, we want to have fewer immigrants because we want to maintain, French identity, let's say. Well, who are you to say what French identity is? I mean, it's not as if everybody agrees on this. And, there may be some people who say, well, I'd like a little bit less Frenchness and, a little bit more, free labor, more cultural diversity, a little bit more variety in the cuisine, whatever it is. So your cultural preferences are really preferences about how your fellow countrymen should behave. And again, it's not clear to me that you have a great case for imposing your preferences on your fellow citizens.
On a biographical note, how did you come to be interested in this topic?
Not really sure, because I've always been interested in it to some degree. I was born in Malaya as it was then. I moved to Australia when I was about 6 months old, when my father was a student in Melbourne. Moved back then to Malaya in around about 1961, and then moved to Australia when I was 12, and then moved from Australia to the UK to study, and then I moved to the US, then back to Australia, and then to the US again, and then I worked in the UK, and now I'm in Singapore. So of course, I would be interested in immigration as a political theorist because that's part of my life experience. I think the other important reason is that when I was growing up in Malaysia, Malaysia developed very strong preferential policies at a racial basis to prefer Malays, or regarded as indigenous, over Indians and Chinese. So I was very conscious of this, and I always wanted to write about it. And eventually I did, writing about multiculturalism. Well, then writing about multiculturalism, I became interested both in claims of indigeneity, whether Malays in Malaysia or Aborigines in Australia, and I became very in arguments about culture with respect to immigrants. So that really then meant my interest in immigration took off. Over the course of time, I also became what I would now describe as a classical liberal, which meant, a greater interest in and commitment to individual freedom. So it immediately occurred to me that restrictions on immigration were an infringement of freedom. So I became interested in exploring this topic more philosophically, and then also, I guess, politically and sociologically.
Do you have any book recommendations for something that would complement this book especially well?
There is a very good book I've just read recently. The interesting thing about this particular book is it's called something like How Immigration Really Works. And it essentially says, here's the myth, here's the reality. So one of them, for example, is, the myth is that immigration controls reduce immigration.
By Hein de Haas?
Yes, that's the one. I'd strongly recommend that as a book. It's not as much a philosophical book as a very good, up-to-date factual analysis of the way immigration operates. And if you're someone who wants to control immigration, well, this would be a very useful book for you to read, because it would tell you why all the policies that are being pursued to reduce immigration are probably doing the opposite.
That's a great recommendation. This is immediately on my list. And do you have any projects you want to plug?
I've got one nearing completion and then one a little bit further into the future. The one nearing completion is another book on immigration called Dialogues on Immigration and the Open Society. I've just sent a draft of the manuscript to Rutledge. It's written in dialogue form, a conversation between the main interlocutor, and it was a professor, and 6 of his students on immigration. I try to cover some topics that are not in my immigration book, but there's a little bit of overlap. But it's written to be a bit more accessible, less technical. It's a conversation. So I'm not sure when that will be out, maybe sometime next year, depending on what the reviewers of the manuscript say.
Is the conversation much based on real conversations from your teaching?
No, I've not really taught the subject. So the conversations are all invented, but I use some of the names of former PhD students of mine just for the fun of it.
Well, dialogues are very easy to read, so I'll look forward to that.
Yeah. And then the other project is a longer term thing I'm working on, capitalism and human nature.
Untitled thus far?
So far, titled Capitalism and Human Nature. Maybe it'll end up being Capitalism, Human Nature, and the Meaning of Life. I'm not sure. But it stems from a dissatisfaction with the way a lot of people talk about immigration, about capitalism. It seems to me on one side they put into the term everything they dislike in the world, and on the other side they put into it everything they like. But it means people end up talking past each other. They're not really talking about the same thing. So I want to see whether we can get some sort of conceptual clarity on this. But I also want to explore a little bit why it is that we have some of the institutions and practices that we have. Why is it that, for example, markets always turn up, whether you're talking about nation states or whether you're talking about prisons, for example. I think you've interviewed Dave Scarbeck before on this.
Yes.
Why is it markets pop up everywhere? Well, I think it probably has something to do with our nature, and I'd like to explore this a little bit more and see what we can say about capitalism from that perspective.
Yeah, in prisons, in communist societies, there's a whole studied phenomenon of the black markets in the Soviet Union that, the society couldn't have existed without.
Yes.
Well, also very much looking forward to that. You said that's a longer term project?
Yeah, I think that will probably be sometime over the next 5 years, because aside from this other book I've got to complete, I'm also working on a book with my wife, who's also a political theorist, Christine Henderson. It's a book on Hayek and Tocqueville, and we've got a couple of chapters written on this. So we will hopefully finish that by maybe the middle of next year. I'm about to go on sabbatical leave, so there's some time to work on it. So I should have mentioned that really as the second project, but that's a joint project.
Well, they all sound interesting. And where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
Probably the best place is Academia EDU, where I have a page and I upload papers that I've got, drafts and so on. But otherwise, probably Amazon or Google are the best places.
Wonderful. Well, my guest has been political scientist and Singapore Management University professor Chandran Kukathas, and his book, once again, is Immigration and Freedom. Chandran, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.